to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9. As we turn there this morning, allow me to introduce our text to you because we've been spending the last year in the Gospel according to Mark, and Isaiah is set in a very different time and historical setting. Isaiah really is set in front of an ominous backdrop. The ancient Near East entered a new chapter in world history because for the first time, the world saw an empire whose expressed mission was to conquer every square inch of the planet. What's more, not only was that their expressed mission, but to the rest of the world, it looked like the Assyrians might have a chance of conquering everyone and everything that stood in their way. They were a bloodthirsty pagan nation who believed that their gods had commissioned them to conquer everything, to kill anyone who stood in their way, and that if the Assyrians ever lost a battle, the gods would cause the world to come to an end. And so they fought with an eschatological urgency. They fought with an urgency that was wrapped up in the end times, or so they thought. The rest of the nations surrounding Assyria had to figure out what they would do. Should we throw in our lot with the bloodthirsty Assyrians and hope that they treat us just a little bit better? Or should all the rest of us, smaller nations, band together, stand against the Assyrians, and try our best to stop them from conquering us? The nations of Syria, now, not to be confused with Assyria. They're two different nations. There's Syria, which still exists today, and then there's the empire of the Assyrians. Syria and Assyria. I'll try and keep those distinct so as to not confuse. So the nation of Syria and the nation of Ephraim, as it's called in the book of Isaiah, it's also known as Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And throughout Isaiah, God speaks of Israel as being Ephraim, the northern tribe. So Syria and Ephraim decide they're going to pool their resources together and go to war with the Assyrians. It's called the Syro-Ephraimite Alliance and the Syro-Ephraimite Wars of around the year 730 BC. Syria and Ephraim decide they're going to come together and go to war with the Assyrians, and they come knocking on Judah's door. And they say, "You're going to war with us." Remember, at this point, Israel is split into two kingdoms, northern and southern. Judah is the southern kingdom, and Ephraim, or Israel, is the northern kingdom. And they say, "You are going with us to war with the Assyrians." What was Judah's response? Judah's response was to resist this alliance and instead do the one thing that they could do worse than joining them, and that is to pay the Assyrians to come in and fight the Syro-Ephraimite alliance. It's been said that Judah paying the Assyrians is like a mouse paying a cat to eat another mouse. Eventually, the cat is going to be back for its next meal. And that's exactly what happened. The Assyrians came in and fought and destroyed Assyria and Israel, and they were back just within a matter of years, knocking on Judah's door once again. And so Ahaz, the king of Judah, made a bad move to pay the Assyrians, and in the end, it really didn't help them at all. So Isaiah is set in front of an ominous backdrop, or an ominous historical backdrop, but it's not just historical, it's also theological, because as we mentioned, the Assyrians were on a theological conquest. They thought that their gods had commissioned them to do so, but also in the bigger picture, when nations were going to war with one another, they thought that there was a reflection of their respective deities. A strong nation had strong gods. A weak nation had weak gods. Or maybe if somebody lost a battle, it might not be because their gods are weak, but because their gods are cursing them. And if a nation won, it's because their gods were blessing them. And so these political and military chess matches were really just an earthly reflection of the divine chess matches that were happening amongst what they thought were the gods. And so we see, for example, in the book of Isaiah, when Assyria does come back to fight the Judeans, the general of the Assyrian army says this: "Do not let your God, in whom you trust, deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. Shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them? The nations that my fathers destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, the people of Eden who were in Telassar. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of the Sepharvaim, the king of Hena, the king of Ivah? Do you hear? Assyria says, your God can't deliver you any more than Egypt's gods didn't deliver them. Any more than the rest of these nations' gods have been able to help them. In other words, your God is no different than the rest. The funny thing about the message of Isaiah is one of the main things God wants to communicate to Isaiah, to Israel, and to the rest of the nations is God is nothing like the rest of the pagan gods. In fact, God is nothing like anything in creation because God alone is uncreated and transcendent. God is holy. God is other. We hear holy and we think pure or righteous. Holy really in the Old Testament and specifically in Isaiah means other, foreign, a little bit scary. And so God is not only holy, God also chose the nation of Israel to be holy. God said, I am holy, and therefore you will be holy, and you will be a little picture to the world of what a holy other God is like, because you will be a holy other nation. But what did Israel do? Instead, they engaged in the pagan idolatry of the rest of the nations, and they were not what God had intended them to be. And so we have an ominous historical backdrop. We have a sad theological backdrop. What have we seen in Isaiah up to this point in chapters 1 through 8? We'll be reading in chapter 9. Up to this point in Isaiah, God has been exposing the idolatry and the faithfulness of his own people. He's also promised that he will wash their sin as white as snow. He's predicted a time when the word of the Lord will rule from Jerusalem, and that all the nations will come to Jerusalem for judgment and for law. In fact, he said that the nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Up to this point in Isaiah, God has called Isaiah to be a prophet to a stubborn people who will not listen to him. In the last couple of chapters, God has told King Ahaz, the king of the Judeans, not to worry about this Syro-Ephraimite alliance, not to worry about these two nations knocking on their door saying, go with us to fight the Assyrians, because he says there will be a child born of a young maiden or of a virgin, and his name will be Emmanuel. And by the time that child is a couple of years old, these nations will be long gone. The funny story is that there's actually two fulfillments there. One of them immediately is Isaiah's son, who is born, and by the time he's a couple of years old, the Syro-Ephraimite alliance is long gone. But then we're all well familiar with the further fulfillment of that, aren't we? Of the one who was called, literally, Emmanuel. And so, chapter 8, God warns the Israelites not to walk in the way of the people. He says this, quote, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. I will come back to this verse at the end of the sermon, but this really is a key verse for the entire book of Isaiah. If you want to know what Isaiah is about, that's a pretty good snapshot of the entire theme of the book, because it deals with the empires and people fearing men and their kingdoms and their militaries. And he says, regardless of who is against you, regardless of what nations rise and what nations fall, God uses the nations. God is actually the one who rules over the nations, and he uses them for his own purpose. He uses the Assyrians to judge the northern 10 tribes. He uses the Babylonians to judge the southern couple of tribes. And then the Greeks come along, and the Persians and the Romans. And so at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about the respective deities. It's about what God is doing in his sovereign plan with the nations. And so in the backdrop of Isaiah, and as we approach this text, be thinking of empires. Be thinking of wicked and unwise rulers. Be thinking of whatever I was going to say, I just forgot. Sorry. Our text this morning breaks into two clean parts, and one of them is the prediction of peace we'll see in verses 1 through 5, and then there will be a perpetrator of peace, the one who actually brings about the peace. And so read with me Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Isaiah 9, 1 through 7 says, but there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of the hosts will do this. And so look with me in verses 1 through 5 at this prediction of peace. This prediction of peace. Read verse 1 again. It says, "There will be no gloom for her who is in anguish." There will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. I want you to note a couple of things. First of all, if we're not careful, we can be confused by the verb tenses that Isaiah uses throughout this passage. In other words, is Isaiah speaking of the past or the present or the future? Because sometimes he talks about things as if they're not happening yet. And other times he talks about them as if they've already happened. For clarity, even though Isaiah will use different verb tenses, I want you to know that Isaiah is prophesying. And by definition, prophesying means that it hasn't happened yet, at least at Isaiah's point in history. In 730 BC, Isaiah is talking about something that will happen. Why does he talk about things as if they've already happened? Because he is so sure that it's going to happen. God has revealed that God is over time. God can see what's going to happen. God is sovereign and controls time in the nations. And so Isaiah can speak about it as if it's already past because it is so secure. He's talking about the time when all these things are already accomplished. And so he's going to speak sometimes in the future, sometimes in the past, but know that he is speaking of something that has not yet come in his time in 730 BC. As verse 1 continues, it says, "In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations." You notice he's saying that there was a time of judgment for this area of Zebulun and Naphtali. Who are Zebulun and Naphtali? They're two of the northern 10 tribes. Isaiah is simply speaking of the northern kingdom. And he says that in a former time that there was some kind of a judgment on them, which if you read chapter 8, you will see God is saying that because of the pagan idolatry in which the northern tribes are engaging, God is going to put them in a time of judgment and of darkness. Because in chapter 8 it says that here they are fearing these empires and these leaders, and who are they going to get their answers? They're not going to the prophet. They're not going to the temple. They're going to necromancers and mediums who claim to speak on behalf of spirits and the dead. Where is Israel seeking her answers? From necromancers. And so God says as a result of their idolatry, he's going to put them in a time of darkness and of judgment. But verse 1 simply says that that won't be the end for the northern kingdom. He says that for the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, where there had been a judgment, where there had been contempt and darkness, he says in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Judgment is not the end for the 10 tribes in the north. This is really interesting because when the kingdom split, it seemed like God had stuck being faithful to the southern tribes of Judah, and we didn't really know what to think about what God was going to do with the northern tribes. And yet here, God affirms that there will be a time when he ceases his judgment of the northern kingdom, and interestingly enough, it's going to begin in Galilee. For those of us who are familiar with the Gospel of Mark, we know how this begins, but I'm trying to read this as if it's 730 BC and if we've not heard of this famous figure in the New Testament. And so somehow this judgment is going to cease and it's going to begin in the land of Galilee of the nations. Verse 2, it says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has a light shone." Those who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Of course, when we read this and you hear darkness and light, it's not speaking of literal darkness and light. Darkness and light are metaphors for morality and immorality, respectively. The northern tribes were walking in darkness, meaning they were worshiping idols. They were engaging in some very interesting pagan ceremonies, to say the least. They were consulting necromancers. In other words, they were walking in darkness. They're confused. They're stubbing their toes. They don't know where they are because they're living lives of darkness and of immorality. And God says that there's going to be some kind of a great light that shows on them, even though they're walking in darkness. Isn't that the good news of God's character? Isn't that amazing? That God sees people walking in darkness, stubbing their toes, even sinning against him and offending him and hurting themselves. And what's his response? Is it to just abandon them and judge them and let them go? Well, sometimes he does judge them with darkness and even more darkness. But do you see, God's character many times is to shine a light on us even when we are walking in darkness. Many of us know that, don't we? Many of us walked in darkness and didn't know where to go, and God saw us, and of course he was offended at our sin and our darkness, and yet he was also merciful. Titus chapter 3 tells us he saved us not because of things done by us in goodness, but because he had mercy and pity on us. And our only hope in this life is that God would see us walking in darkness and that he would feel pity on us and he would desire to shine a light on us. And we see that in a picture in Galilee. There's people walking in darkness, and it says that God is sending some kind of a light to shine on them and give them truth and give them clarity so that they don't any longer have to walk in darkness and in moral confusion. The funny thing is, light isn't always good news for people. How do people typically respond to the light? Well, sometimes we respond rightly and sometimes we don't. There's a famous figure in the New Testament who says that the judgment has come because the light has come and men loved darkness rather than light because their works were evil. So sometimes when God shines a light on us, we don't really respond right because we would rather live in our own darkness. We would rather scatter like cockroaches right back into the darkness. Is that the result of this light shining? Continue with me in verse 3. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, and they are glad as they are glad when they divide the spoil. And so when God shines this light in the area of Galilee, it seems like people respond rightly. In fact, it says, you multiplied the nation. This is a relevant question for Israel at this time because they are being threatened by empires who are threatening to overrule them and to kill them and to do away with Israel altogether. And yet Isaiah says that in a future time, this judgment will be removed and the nation will be multiplied. Even the northern 10 tribes, not just Judah, but also the northern 10 tribes will be multiplied. It says they have joy. You increase joy. They rejoice before you as with the joy at harvest, as they're glad when they divide the spoil. You see, Israel is going to be the spoil for the next few centuries. They are going to be the ones under slavery and being plundered. And yet God says in a future time, Israel will be the one dividing the spoil. Israel will be the one enjoying the harvest. Verse 4 continues, for the yoke of his burden, the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. What does he mean by all this imagery? The yoke of his burden, the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor. You see, these nations are going to come along, and Israel doesn't know this at this point, but Assyria will come and destroy the northern 10 tribes and take them into exile and captivity. Babylon will come along later and do the same thing to the southern tribes. And then Persia will come along, and then the Greeks will come along, and then the Romans will come along. And you know what? Israel is going to pay tribute to Gentiles until AD 70. When they're destroyed altogether. The people themselves aren't destroyed, but as a nation, they're done for. And so God is affirming that that's not the end for them. That this yoke of slavery, that this oppression that the other nations are going to bring about, it says, notice at the end of verse 4, you have broken as on the day of Midian. You might ask, what does that mean? Who's Midian? If you're familiar with biblical history, then you know Midian was a nation who fought with Israel earlier in their history. In fact, in the book of Judges, Midian ruled over Israel, and Israel paid tribute to them for a matter of 5 or 6 years. And so they were ruled over by this neighbor of theirs that had overtaken them. But what happened? Gideon came along with his 300 men, and they booted Midian out, and there was like 10,000 people in the Midianite army, and there was this miraculous military victory. Even though Israel was the underdog, even though Midian had the upper hand, God miraculously booted Midian out. And the funny thing is, that's the last historical mention that we have of them in the Bible. It seems like at this point in Isaiah's history, Midian isn't even on the scene anymore. And so God is saying that this oppression that you're facing right now from the Assyrians, that you will face from the rest of these Gentile empires, guess what? All those guys are going to be just like Midian. God is going to kick them out, and you will have a time of harvest and liberation. Notice as it continues that this is a peace that the world really hasn't seen. Verse 5 says, every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. This is an interesting thing because how is peace usually accomplished and enforced? We've experienced relative times of peace in human history. You can think, for example, of the Pax Romana, of the Roman peace. How did the Romans accomplish peace? Ironically, by slaughtering their enemies. How did the Romans enforce peace? By being stronger than everybody else, and if a threat ever rose up, the Romans put them right back down. So there was a time of relative peace when the Romans were in charge, but was there still a military? Absolutely. One of the strongest militaries the world has ever seen. You can even say something similar about today, relatively speaking. I have to be very careful and calculated with my words, but we are experiencing a time of relative peace, aren't we? Why? Because of the bloody wars that were fought in World Wars I and II in Korea and Vietnam, not to mention the Cold War and the tension that we had with the Soviet Union for decades, not to mention what's going on in the Middle East. It feels like every time we get more involved, it gets worse, and if we pull out, it gets worse. We don't know what to do, and we're experiencing a time of peace, but there is still an incredible dire need for military, isn't there? What is Isaiah saying? Isaiah is saying there's going to be a time of peace when there won't even be a need for a military. He's saying that, just like he said back in chapter 2, there won't be swords or spears, and specifically here, he says that the military garb will be thrown in the fire. There will be no need for a military. Or as John Oswalt puts it, God will not supplant oppression with greater oppression, nor will he replace warfare with warfare. Instead, he will do away with war altogether. So Israel's going to go under judgment. It's not going to last forever. A light is going to shine. There's going to be some kind of a harvest and a spoil and a time of peace that the world has never seen. There's the prediction of peace. But at that point, we have to stop and ask the question, how? How can such a peace be accomplished? How in the world could God ever do any of this? It's never seemed to work before. There's never been a time in human history when we haven't needed a military. That's what Isaiah answers in verses 6 and 7. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. We see, first of all, that there's a child born and that this son is given, and he has these many names. One commentator has noted what's interesting about the titles that this child is given is the title that he's not given. He's not called a king here. It's obvious that he is a king because verse 7 says that he sits on the throne of David and over his kingdom, but he's not specifically called a king. And some commentators have noticed that this is probably an intentional slap at the Jerusalem monarchy. You see, Ahaz is ruling over them right now, and he's making terrible decisions. And there's kings over Egypt and over Assyria and over everybody else, and they're all a bunch of wicked jerks. And so this commentator says that if that's a king, then this child who's coming won't even share that title. It's obvious that he's a king. But these people who are ruling now have really slandered what a king really is supposed to be. And so this child will come, and he will be something like nothing that any king has ever been. ever. I want you to notice that it doesn't just say a child is born, but that a son is given. Note that word given. Is that weird? If you think about it, if something is given, that implies that it existed before it was given. That implies that there's a change of hands here. You see, a birth is an inception. It's a beginning. This seems to imply that the son who is given really predates his own birth. He's not just some guy. He's not just Hezekiah or David who's born like any other man. There's something different and seemingly pre-existent about this son who is given. Notice that it says, the government shall be upon his shoulder. The government shall be upon his shoulder. How is this peace going to be ushered in? Because of the way that this child rules the government. Do you want to know what's wrong with government? With human government? With any form of government? Do you want to know why monarchy doesn't work? You might have a good king for a while. You might have ups and downs. But eventually some rotten egg comes along and sits on the throne, and he's a tyrant, and he ruins everything for everybody, doesn't he? Do you want to know why democracy eventually fails? Because in the same way as one king being a rotten egg and sitting in one seat, eventually you have 435 seats filled with rotten eggs, and 50 Senate seats or 100 Senate seats filled with rotten eggs. And eventually people rule or ruin every form of government. I want you to pretend with me for a second that communism and socialism could be a viable system. Let's pretend for a second that those systems of government aren't built on taking people's personal property. Do you know why they would eventually fail? Because people are the worst. Because people ruin everything. It doesn't matter how small or big your government is, eventually it's going to fail because wicked people will be the one on the steering wheel, will be the people with their hands on the steering wheel. Why will this child be able to usher in a time of peace like the world has never seen? Because he won't be a wicked, rotten egg like any of you or me. He won't be like us, screwing up everything that he does. He will be like no one else. And we see even further as he's described that he's called a wonderful counselor. Notice that, wonderful counselor. That speaks of someone who was wise. Ahaz wasn't wise. There's going to be kings who come along and a couple of them will be good and the rest of them are going to just be terrible. And they won't be wise and they'll make silly decisions. This child who's coming, he won't be unwise. He won't pay the Assyrians. He will be a wonderful counselor. Even more, he'll be a mighty God. Now, this word mighty God, and I don't know if any of your translations say this, it can also be translated as mighty hero. And I think at Isaiah's point, they wouldn't expect God to literally become incarnated and come and rule and dwell among them. And so they probably would have understood this as being a mighty hero. He will be some kind of a mighty hero. Now, we have hindsight, and we know that God literally did come and take on a human body and dwell among us, and he rules in our midst. But notice even more, we hear these titles, Everlasting Father, and I think the one that's most interesting is the Prince of Peace. He's a Prince of Peace. He's going to usher in a time of peace. He's not going to do it with a military like the Romans or like anybody else. He's going to establish a peace, and he's going to be a peaceful ruler. And again, I think that the people who heard this for the first time would have had to ask the question, how in the world do you hold peace if you're just a nice guy? How is it that you can rule and get rid of all military if you don't punish evildoers? If you're some kind of a peaceful ruler, how will you do it? And that's a mystery that gets developed more throughout Isaiah and throughout the rest of the Bible. But I think that the first audience would have been scratching their head at this. How can a Prince of Peace usher in a time of peace? How is it not that he's a warrior that kills everyone who stands in his way, even better than any of the other empires have done or will do? Continue with me in verse 7. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. That's interesting because at this time, Assyria is increasing. And it looks like there's going to be no end to what they can accomplish. Nothing can stand in their way. And so here's this expanding empire, and Isaiah is saying there will be an end to their expanse. There will be an end to their conquest. On the other hand, this Prince of Peace will rule over a kingdom, and it will not have an end. It will cover everything that the Assyrians want to cover and more. It will cover every square inch of the planet and every molecule of the universe. Of his increase of government, you don't have to worry about the increase of their government. You need to know that the increase of his government will not end. Nor of peace. There will be no end of its peace. There's no end to the bloodthirst of these other nations. And yet in this case, it says that there will be no end of peace. What's interesting as we continue is it says that he sits on the throne of David and over David's kingdom. Why is that interesting? Because at this point in Israel's history, David's kingdom has been split for a couple hundred years. They haven't been able to reconcile and come back together for centuries. And so the Judeans who do have the throne of David, they might be thinking, well, yeah, this might be for us, but is it going to be for them? And yet Isaiah is saying there is going to be a Davidic king, just like David said. And he is going to come back. He's going to bring the two kingdoms and put them back together. And not just that, he's going to rule over everything. As verse 7 continues, it says that he establishes it and upholds it with justice and righteousness. As we've already seen, how do these other nations establish and uphold their kingdoms? They do it by subduing anybody who would say otherwise. They do it with violence and with fear and with threats. How is this Prince of Peace going to rule? He's going to do it in justice and in righteousness. Notice that it says, from this time forth and forevermore, this kingdom will not have an end. This Prince of Peace is going to come in and usher a kingdom that will never end. It already said that about the geography of it, but this is speaking of the time. You know, the Assyrians, they're going to come through, they're going to shoot up like a weed and be done in a few decades. The same thing with the Babylonians. They're going to shoot up like a weed, and in a few decades, they're going to be gone. The Persians, the Achaemenid dynasty, impressively will rule for 200 years. The Greeks, Alexander will shoot up and he'll be dead within 10 years. The Romans, goodness sake, they rule for 500 years over the entire Mediterranean. They don't even cover 10% of the earth's landmass, and they do it for a matter of centuries. Isaiah is telling us that this Prince of Peace, this king, he's going to come and rule forever. It will be nothing like the empires of men. Notice, last of all, it says that the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The zeal of the Lord of hosts. As opposed to what? As opposed to the zeal that's ruling kingdoms in Isaiah's day and the zeal that rules our kingdoms this day. Sometimes we have good intentions and we want to protect our neighbors. Sometimes there are empires that are established and built on the zeal of a monarch or somebody who wants their own belly to be filled, or they want their own harem, or they want their own well-being, or their family, or their name, or whatever it is. But men's kingdoms are not established in the zeal of the Lord. And yet Isaiah is saying that there's this kingdom coming. It will have no end of its increase. It will have no end in time. And how will it be brought about? By justice and righteousness. And what's going to accomplish all of this? The zeal of the Lord of hosts. Through this child who is born, through this son who is given. What's interesting is when you read the rest of the book of Isaiah, because this isn't the last mention of this son who is given. In fact, throughout the rest of Isaiah, and I encourage you to read Isaiah and see what he has to say about this son, this servant as he calls him. And I want you to pretend, as you read through, if you do, what would the original audience have thought if they didn't know who Jesus was? It would be confusing. It really would. Because as you continue, Isaiah says things like he's going to bring justice to the Gentile nations, but he's going to do it without quarreling or crying aloud. What? How can you do that? How can you bring justice without the sword, without executing evildoers? And yet Isaiah, in some mysterious way, says that this servant is going to do it without quarreling or crying aloud. In fact, as he continues, in Isaiah 52 and 53, he seems to suggest that this servant who God is going to send, this son whom God is going to give to rule over the nations, somehow he's going to accomplish God's will. He's going to do all of this not just without quarreling, but in some way he's going to succeed even though he loses his life. Isaiah's audience is scratching their head. How can you accomplish all of this if you can't even survive? And yet that is Isaiah's message, is that God will send his servant, anointed by his own Spirit, who will come and bring justice to the Gentiles without quarreling or crying aloud, and that somehow, even though he won't survive, he will carry out God's will, even though it cost him his life. At the end of the day, we have to ask, what is this passage about? Or what is really the book of Isaiah about? It's about God sending a son to undo the effects of sin on the earth. Why is Israel living in fear and in oppression? Because they've disobeyed. Israel did not do what God intended for them to do, and they're under judgment, and they're being threatened and oppressed by the nations. And so what does this text tell us? God is going to send some kind of a light, some son, who will undo the effects of their sin. They got themselves there in their sin, they're under judgment, and God sends a child to remove the effects of their sin. Really, that's the rest of the book of Isaiah, but in the bigger picture, because it's not just Israel alone who's disobedient. It's not just Israel themselves who've gotten themselves into a mess because of the sins that they've committed. That's the case with the rest of the nations. That's the case with you and me. And the good news for us is that God didn't just send this son to undo the effects of Israel's sin. He came to send this son to undo the effects of the sin of you and me. The things that you and I have done. You see, we deserve judgment just like Israel did, but even more so. We deserve not just to be oppressed by other nations. You and I deserve to suffer under God's wrath for eternity in hell. And just in the same way that God sent this son to liberate Israel from their immediate oppression, God sent his son to free us from the wrath that awaits us in death if we don't repent. And so we have made a mess for ourselves just like the Israelites made a mess for themselves. And yet God sent this servant to do this. In Isaiah 53, you might have to ask, well, how can he undo this curse? How can he get rid of the judgment? How can he remove the punishment that we deserve? Allow me to read to you from Isaiah 53. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Israel made a mess for themselves, and they dug a pit for themselves, but so did you and I. Isaiah tells us that like sheep wandering with no direction, we've just gone astray. We've walked in darkness. And you know that. You know that that used to be you, or that that's potentially still you, that you still think that you're the captain of your own ship. You still think that you're the master of your own destiny. I'm just a little wayward. I can just do this for a little while and I'll come back around. Isaiah, the Bible, it says that waywardness is sin, and that waywardness merits punishment for us. And yet the good news is that God sees us walking waywardly in the same way that he saw Galilee walking in darkness and consulting necromancers and mediums. You know, we might not consult necromancers, but we sure make some silly decisions, don't we? We sure go in silly directions, even though we don't need a psychic to help us do it. And yet God saw us walking in darkness, and he sent his son Jesus to take our punishment, to be brutalized and to be killed on our behalf, so that a great light could shine on us, and so that he could bring us into his family. That's what this passage is about. It's about this son coming to undo the effects of sin. That's what the message of Isaiah is about. God isn't like any other God. God isn't like anything that we know. And yet, even though he was holy, and even though we sinned and shook our fists against him and went our own ways, he sent his son to take our punishment and to bring us into his fold. We live in a culture that loves to talk about Santa and wrapping paper and Christmas lights and family and things that are great. But this Christmas season, don't just think about Santa. Don't just think about presents and family, which are wonderful things to be enjoyed. Think about the fact that you made a mess of your life, and God sent his son to rescue you from that mess. And not just the mess of debt or the mess of strained relationships, the mess of deserving God's wrath. He loved you so much that he gave up his son, that his son would take a punishment for us so that we could be brought into his family and so that we could glorify him and worship him. But there's another thing I think we can do with this text. There's another way that I think we can apply this text. Because Isaiah lived in a day that was wrought with the fear of men. You have political chess, you have military strategy all around, and you wonder what's going to happen to the Assyrians, and how is their economy doing, and how is their military doing. And they had their eyes on the empires of men. We don't have the Assyrians arising and coming straight for us the way that they did, but we sure are tempted to be paying attention to the stupid political chess that the world plays, don't we? We spend more time watching the news and reading news articles than we do being fed from the Word. And so I think Isaiah's message is relevant to us today. Ask yourself that. How much time do you spend hearing from God's Word? How much time do you spend in communion with Him? Versus how much time do you spend worrying about the empires of men and Russia and China's economy in the Middle East? It's not wrong to be interested in those things, but we should be more interested in God's Word. What's more, God says, come with me back to Isaiah 8, verses 11 through 13. And we'll end there. Isaiah 8, 11 through 13 says, "The Lord spoke to me thus with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him shall you honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it, and they shall fall and be broken, and they shall be snared and taken." At the end of the day, remember this: no matter what nations are in power, no matter how well our nation and our economy and our military are doing, God rules over the kings of men for his own purposes. And we might not like what he's doing with our nation or with the other nations. But no matter what, don't fear our nation. Don't fear the nations of the world. Rather, fear God. Know that he uses them for his own purposes, and that your job isn't to worry about those things. Your job is to live a holy and righteous life in the midst of no matter who rules over you. We are called to live holy lives because God is holy. And how can we not desire to live holy lives after hearing that he would send his Son for us? Amen? Amen. Let's pray.